it feels in a sense as if we are, as if we have abducted you in order to recruit you somewhere in the back of a truck and train you and induct you on the way to the battleground. And now we get the opportunity to offload you somewhere in the middle of nowhere and describe the enemy. In order to look at this debate and to understand the defining character of this debate, it's perhaps interesting to keep in mind the great differences between Sartre and the first person who would be his really major antagonist intellectually, and that is Claude Lévi-Strauss. As you know, he was an anthropologist. He died quite recently at the age of 101. And the reading which you have is the final chapter of a work misleadingly translated as The Savage Mind, which could almost be designed to give apoplexy to some shallow, politically correct characters. But sauvage does not mean savage, it means the opposite of domesticated. So to talk about pensée sauvage is not to talk about the savage mind, it is in fact to talk about the mind or thought or the mind in its undomesticated state, which is a very interesting point of entry for any philosophical discussion. Now, it's also particularly surprising to find that this philosophical opposition to Sartre is not coming from sophisticated follower of, say, Heidegger within the existential phenomenological tradition, such as Gadamer. And it's not coming from any of the Marxists whom he so roundly and interestingly attacks. And Sartre's thought has already survived an attack from the very erudite, the very brilliant Maurice Merleau-Ponty, his colleague and friend, who is also traveling the Marxism phenomenology existentialist path a little earlier than Sartre, but that this definitive, this game changer should come from an anthropologist. We most often know anthropologists as timid apologists for colonialism, working for some lousy colonial administration or another, spying on people who've been invaded and whose countries have been occupied and so on. But Levi-Strauss is a slightly more refined exponent. And it is the project of anthropology, not its sometimes lamentable history, that provides his position with the interest and the strength which it does. You may well know that Levi-Strauss studies initially law, decides to abandon law in order to pursue philosophy, is forced into exile by the German invasion, spends time in New York, spends with very interesting people, including André Breton and other émigrés, and takes up a position more or less out of expediency at a cultural institute in Brazil, where he sort of ticks a box and finds himself involved in the need to do field work among the colonized people of Brazil, who by then had retreated very far from the cities and the plantations and so on. So he finds himself accidentally an anthropologist, but being a very extraordinary individual, he quickly masters the anthropological literature, which at the time is evenly divided among Africanists, among Americanists, such as Boas, and among Latin Americanists or South Americanists. What he brings to it, obviously, like anybody educated in his time, is a very thorough understanding of the French sociological project, the project of Émile Durkheim, and of Durkheim's nephew, Marcel Mauss, who writes, well, both of them write very extensively on non-Western societies in order to shape a particular sociology, which puts huge emphasis on the social fact, on the idea that social interactions almost bring about the fundamental elements of our understanding. They bring about the stability of the days of the week, of the calendar, of time and space, of language, etc. Whatever cultural stability, whatever cognitive stability we have, is a result of a kind of broad consensus, and it's established and re-established by things which are almost everyday rituals that maintain this consensus on a level that's not deliberate. That is simply pure Durkheim, and that is really the core of the French anthropological stock of ideas that Lèvi-Strauss comes into the picture with. But it is one thing to be a social constructivist, and it is another thing to go beyond the sheer sociology of what makes societies and equips societies, and give it a foundation in something much deeper than human convention or human practice. And it is here that Lèvi-Strauss anthropology links onto the profound and profoundly disturbing tradition of formalism in European, and particularly Eastern European thought. He finds himself in exile and subsequently collaborating with the great linguist Roman Jakobson, who had been part of the Prague Circle and had been part of the Russian post-revolutionary explorations of language and linguistics. And Jakobson was somebody who had, perhaps more than others, built on the legacy of Ferdinand de Saussure in looking at language as an autonomous system related only to itself and made up of elements which are in themselves not at all meaningful. And Jakobson's contribution to linguistics was, among many contributions, was the clarification of the idea of the phoneme. Now, the phoneme is almost like the atom of language. It is not a letter or a word or even a sound. It operates at a level below the letter, the word, and the sound. It makes letter, word, and sound possible. It is the smallest difference in language that can change language. So in other words, the difference between cat and bat would be a phonemic difference expressed in the different letters and the sounds. So the phoneme is this tiny structuring element of language, which is hardly part of the surface of language, no matter how far down you go. And that phonemes are organized in relation to each other. They structure language by retaining relations to each other. And even though we're unaware of them when we speak, we are brilliantly doing nothing but manipulate these phonemes. And in a way, to speak is to explore the field opened up by the phonemes and their relations in any particular language. Well, so much for Jakobson. You can tell your grandchildren, yes, Jakobson, he's the guy who said the phoneme. But in any case, Lèvi-Strauss takes from Jakobson the idea that there is a level of inquiry into humans, into culture, into society, that is absolutely structured. It is structured in a way that can be geometrically, mathematically expressed. It can be expressed in set theory. It can be expressed in a number of very explicit formal ways, hence the notion of formalist. It is formalizable. It can be expressed through mathematical models. It can be exhaustively expressed as a set of relations. But it is also completely unconscious. Nobody can speak a language or make up a language or write a poem by saying, I'm going out to manipulate phonemes. But without the ability to inhabit and manipulate these phonemes. You can't speak, you can't write a poem, and in fact you can't make sense of a poem. So there is this level at once profoundly formal and absolutely unconscious, absolutely inaccessible to experience, even the experience of the speaker who uses it, that Jacobson has found, and that for him dials in the reality of language. So language is not a human or cultural artifact. In fact, it seems that human or cultural artifacts are projections off the surface of language, according to this account. So Lèvi-Strauss inherits this very strong, very, in a way, subversive legacy of formalism. And this formalism is not a cultural position simply confined to linguistics. It provides, of course, a huge support and encouragement to linguists, but it also provides the basis for an aesthetic of the Russian formalists and of the Prague Circle. It provides a new way of, in fact, understanding the poetic. It provides a new way of understanding thought. It provides a very intriguing way of understanding thought, because it doesn't draw a hard and fast distinction between what is literal and what is not literal. It will show that thought, language, expression, what we can say to ourselves, what we can think about ourselves, in fact is made up of the same set of ingredients, and that in fact there is as much thought or as much cognition in poetry as there is rhetoric in a literal statement, like the cat is on the mat and so on. So there is this intriguing blend of what would seem to be literal and what would seem to be aesthetic in the Russian formalist tradition. And this also extends to the handling of language, the view of language in somebody like Jacobson and his colleagues. Well, enough Jacobson. But what he does give Lèvi-Strauss is the idea that human reality, that culture, and even experience can be approached and explained and modeled on the basis of something which is both very formally explicit, but lies beyond experience, and hence must be, in a very literal sense, unconscious, in the sense of inaccessible to experience. Now you can already see the beginnings of a clash with Sartre, because for Sartre, the fundamental means, the gateway by which experience is revealed and our condition as beings and our formats of action and our aspirations to meaning and our aspirations to change are all revealed through consciousness. So you could say that Sartre, in a way, is the very antipode of a view based on unconsciousness, based on the absolute inaccessibility of what determines us. For Sartre, you can arrive descriptively at an understanding of yourself, at an understanding of others, at an understanding of history, at an understanding of politics as the active appropriation or unfolding of history. And you never leave this domain of powerful description, but you never leave contact with what is conscious. Your guiding thread in this is what is conscious. Of course, to then propose that a science of the human, the science of society, that an account of the same kinds of facts that Sartre is canvassing in his critique of dialectical reason, in his attempt to find an inner logic and an access point of history, capital H, that all of this is in fact inaccessible to humans, and that in some sense humans may be subject to it, is a very repellent suggestion to Sartre. Now, Lèvi-Strauss is quite aware of the fact when he writes this book called Undomesticated Thought. Let's give it its proper name. Undomesticated thought, thought in its wild state, thought doing what thought wants to do. And you can quite understand how one could take this, how plausible this is. After Jacobson's linguistics, thought does what it wants to do. You can perfectly well conceive of thought being formulated at a very formal level, and a very unconscious level, where it does what it wants to do. When you and I and anyone speak a language, we have absolutely no insight into that language. None of us, not even Professional linguists, grammarians, experts on syntax have got a complete syntax of English or anything near to it. Linguistics is almost like an attempt to enter an Aladdin's cave, but really just fiddles with the lock. And but we are speaking perfectly well, but we are speaking by courtesy of language, you could say. But none of us can claim to inhabit language. But what it does do is that it totalizes meanings ahead of us. We don't have to think about where we're going when we speak. We go, and wherever we go, there is something. There is sense, there is meaning. But no thanks to us. You know, language is Geppetto, and you are Pinocchio. And thankfully, because imagine the complication of having to deliberately shuffle phonemes around before you can venture on the road. It's not language, or the ability to speak and think through language is not a praxis. It is not a deliberate human undertaking with a particular purpose and a particular technique. It's in fact a given. So you can imagine the possibility of investigating thought in its given state, because thought coming about in language or through formal structure of a language-like kind, which our investigation into language reveals that maybe all of culture, maybe all of history, maybe all of human experience is in fact suspended upon such formal relations, which we can then investigate and perhaps partially uncover. That it's very tempting to say, well, if those things are left to themselves, what do they do? If language speaks you, what does it say? And what might it say if you don't get in the way? This is certainly not a new question. The entire direction of surrealism as a movement was to ask, what does language say when you don't get in the way? What is automatic writing? What will you write in a trance? What will you write collectively as a result of the momentum of a group, etc., etc.? And of course, earlier than this, the inspiration for surrealism was a couple of decisive works from the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, which all deal with nonsense, but spontaneous and highly structured nonsense. Dreams, jokes, slips of the tongue when you say one thing instead of another. All of these things are literally nonsense. They are a result of language thinking itself, or language arriving at a formulation through you, and it pops out your mouth. And you say something tremendously awful to your in-laws, and you don't know how to call it back. You realize that, in fact, it's quite possible to imagine language doing its thing in its own undomesticated state. And in fact, you could take those early works of Freud as an attempt to grapple with the question of how human development, or what he calls at that time civilization, is a result of strenuous attempts, both on the part of the individual, society, the family, and so on, to domesticate language. So you can see that the issue, the thinkability of the idea of thought, of what is experienceable, imaginable, what we can get a grasp upon, doing its own thing without us, behind our back, so to speak, is not such a strange, it's not a contrived or outrageous thing. It's almost asking to be explored. The way in which the ontological structure of consciousness is almost asking to be explored when Sartre and Heidegger and Husserl come upon that problem and elaborate it. So, Lèvi-Strauss aims to, I will not say satirize, his purpose is not satirical or ironic, but he aims to park something beside the work of Sartre, Sartre's elaborating of a specific human logic of history, a specific human logic of social and political experience. He wants to park something beside it which can explain it and is not assimilable to it. So if you look at the last chapter of Pensée Sauvage, the reading, you will see that Lèvi-Strauss very politely says, my students, my workshop, my laboratory, We've all been reading with avid interest Sartre's book as it comes out. And you must understand that this book of Lèvi-Strauss written in 61, so it's like almost contemporaneous with Sartre's book. So it's like a book comes out by Zizek, a year ago, and then already somebody steps in and writes a book which completely messes it up. So he says we've read this, and we read Sartre with great deference, and we read him with acknowledgement of a great debt to his insights, but in a sense we beg to differ. And the point at which Lèvi-Strauss grasps Sartre is very interesting, because he says that Sartre is really in looking for a specifically human, practice-based, action-based, project-based rationality that can give a meaning to history, that can in fact allow us to produce a meaning in history. He says that Sartre is in fact claiming that there is a distinction between two kinds of reason. Now it's important to understand that in this debate is a debate about the status of reason. And as a working hypothesis, let us say that reason is something which can both allow you to make sense of something and allow you to act in and on that something. The theory can make you make sense of a lot of things, and an ideology or a doctrine or a conviction or a belief can give you the courage or the motivation to act on something. But reason is supposed to unite the ability to grasp something to a point where you can act on it, where you can change it. So the idea of rationality is not just some nice academic goal. You should be rational and you critically discuss and analyze and evaluate according to rational blah blah. Rationality is in fact our ability. It describes an ability to actually understand and to do on the basis of what we understand, and hence be responsible for what we do, because we're doing it on the basis of the understanding we've arrived at. So for Sartre to say that reason has a dialectical status, in other words, to say that we have reason, we have access to something that has these powers like reason, only insofar as we are forced to act. That, for Sartre, is dialectical reason. We act in a situation that's contradictory, therefore the reason we have access to is always contradictory. The projects we undertake are always strategic, they're always likely to be overwritten by a more powerful project, etc., or they're always formulated, not originally, but they're always formulated on the basis of some previous project that we have to probe in depth and understand in order not to reinvent the wheel and so on. All of these involve a historical rationality. But for Lèvi-Strauss, there is another kind of rationality altogether, and he says it's rather a prejudice on the West's part, that it likes to investigate different societies and different states of society and different states of human action historically, as if these things were arranged in terms of distance in time and in terms of the present and in terms of the future. Whereas for him, that is merely a prejudice. He says, as an anthropologist, we prefer to investigate hundreds, thousands of societies whose diversity is expressed in space. They are spatially distinct from one another. And he says, without a doubt, every society, no matter how little, where it is on the planet, from the point of view of the experience of what it is like to be a member of that society, such members of that society do believe themselves to have put everything together morally, scientifically, etc. They don't walk around feeling that they are lacking, that there is some further stage of history or some other type of reason that they don't have. Every society, including, of course, he's saying Western society, somehow has the illusion that it has a competence, that it is somehow in control of itself, that it somehow worked out its own logic. But of course, each one of these societies does these things on completely different and usually incompatible ways. So Lèvi-Strauss is saying that the direct approach, the approach in terms of experience, introspection, developing this from our awareness, is likely to lead us astray. Secondly, he says, what is dialectical reason? What is the special adventurous reason that comes into being only in the project, if not an extension of analytical reason? He says it is the attempt of analytical reason to cast a bridge, to throw a bridge over the unknown, to something that it knows is there but it cannot grasp. Even if that something there is like the horizon and keeps receding, but it is still using analytical reason in order to, in fact, create a speculative extension towards another condition. So he's saying that there is no particular or no distinct dialectical reason. There's no particular reason associated with human action, human meaning, and history. History is just one of the formats in which humans in the West like to understand or get to grips with events and social differences. Of course, all of this would be very irritating to Sartre, because precisely the opposite of what he sets out to demonstrate. He says that you only have something like reason, you only have something like rationality, the ability to do and reflect and do and reflect, once you have sufficiently organized society and action and groups and the relation to the past and a project relation to the future and a risk assessment. Once you're engaged in this thing, it's a doing game. Whereas for Lèvi-Strauss, he says we have access to the way in which thought thinks. Never mind particular groups of humans, the way in which thought thinks. We have access to it through our comparative studies of societies massively separated by space. They're not massively separated by time. He says the idea of history is prejudicial because it wants to take societies that are fully expressed in themselves and then put them into some kind of ranking as if these are more primitive and these are less and so on. So the entire work of Lèvi-Strauss, which I commend you to read, is almost a huge send-up of the Western assumption that there is something distinctive about Western thought and that there is something distinctively exotic about non-Western thought. The entire debate about othering and this, that, and the other would not have even happened if people had read Sartre and Lèvi-Strauss properly or at all, because the terms of othering are completely dominated by the idea of Western historicism, which then tries to liberalize and correct itself or whatever. But on a philosophical level, the idea of just cutting that project off at the roots and then having an alternative way of approaching all kinds of societies with an absolute parity is there in Lèvi-Strauss. So Lèvi-Strauss, in a sense, is the greater democrat, even though Sartre is the greater exponent of freedom. So the really stunning and interesting point in Lèvi-Strauss is that just as Sartre says that there is a need to link existentialism and Marxism, to link this concrete experience of your existence and history, society, where you have this existence, where you realize it, just as there is a need to link these things, because the human project and the human group, in a sense, embodies the expression of all of these concerns. It embodies historical reason, embodies dialectical reason. This question of where the thing happens and through whom the thing happens is very important for Sartre. What do you have to be in order to be the agent of history? What do you have to be in order to be progressive? What do you have to be in order to be non-self-deceiving? The question of a mode of being and what kind of being can take these projects forward is decisive for Sartre. And of course, the kind of being is a political being, historical being, a very philosophical being, or a writer, one who is engaged, an artist, one who engages experience along these particular dimensions spelt out by Sartre. But for Lèvi-Strauss, something very extraordinary happens. He says that the kind of being who can incarnate thought, right? There are two kinds of being, he says, and these are not the political heroes, and they are not the great artists. For him, the one on the Western model is the engineer, and the other one is the handyman, the bricoleur, the one who tinkers and makes things out of scraps and pre-existent bits and pieces. Now, this is an ingenious argument because, of course, he's saying with the engineer you have the model and the information, and then you can find the objects or the processes or the materials or the forms that perfectly fit the model and the information. but he's saying for the bricoleur, for the handyman, the handy person, right? You start with particular leftovers, objects, and you say, well, what might this be good for? What might this be good for, etc. So in other words, you have the experience of the object, you have the experience of the material, you have the experience itself. And from working with the elements of experience, you will then be able to come to the concept that you need in order to develop something new. So you have this extraordinary argument, very provocative argument, in which the two burning points of human inventiveness are the engineer for the West and this tinkerer. Now, of course, it doesn't take much brains to see that for Lèvi-Strauss, in the West, artists are tinkerers of this kind, as well as yourselves, designers, who are in effect set apart from engineers for reasons which Lèvi-Strauss perhaps spells out for you for the first time, because you have a priority in terms of a given situation, given objects, from which you then work and derive final logic in the design of the project, whereas the engineer has a model, and they then can go and find or search or even develop appropriate materials, forms, and processes to comply to the model. And of course, he's having a good go at Sartre, because he's saying that most Western societies indulge in social engineering, especially in the 20th century. They have a Nazi model, a communist model, a democratic model, a fascist model, an apartheid model, etc., of what a society should be. And then they set out to find the institutions and the ingredients. But he also says that Sartre's idea of praxis, of acting in a historical situation, is really no different to the activity of the handy person, of the artist, of the designer. In fact, you're designing, you're finding things and making up as you go along, when you're adhering to this Marxist idea that humans make history but not in conditions of their own making. In other words, your starting point for practice, for a historical reason, is the given. The given is the leftovers. We are all living in the historical leftovers. In this country, we live in the historical leftovers of people who saw the entire country as their sort of Bantustan playground, and are trying to drag it back to that condition today. So we're all dealing with scraps, and particularly designers, this very notion of design, is a rationality of dealing with scraps. So in a way, design is a perfect example of Sartre's dialectical reason. But for Lèvi-Strauss, the distinction between the engineer and the bricoleur is not a distinction between a certain analytical or scientific reason and a dialectical reason. It is simply two ends or two different starting points of the same analytic reason, something which takes things apart, understands and puts them together on another plane. So he will provocatively take this distinction of the two incarnations of the formal, of structure, of this unconscious capacity, and he will characterize in this realm of undomesticated thought, of thought left to its own devices, he will characterize both of these, not as an art-science distinction, but having brought about two very powerful scientific revolutions in their own terms. He will say that the concrete, thinking in terms of the concrete, classifying the concrete, working with it, and using the concrete example analogously, using analogy as the basis of thought, the way in which we do in design, would bring about the Neolithic revolution. It would bring about as perfect an understanding of nature and of society at the same time as to permit domestication of crops and animals, completely new social forms, completely new techniques, completely new invention. And then only later would this Neolithic revolution, this global almost establishment, if you like, of the bricoleur, then be approached from another side, not really altered, but simply reworked from another side, in order to say, if there is a logic in the concrete, can we not start with the logic and then move towards a new kind of concrete, a new kind of object corresponding to it? And that is the thought of the engineer. So it doesn't say the artist and the physicist, it says the handy person and the engineer. To look at these two different layouts, two different possibilities of approaching thought and incarnating thought, in fact enacting thought, as thought presents itself in its undomesticated state, which for Lèvi-Strauss is always analytical. It's an attempt to classify, to compare, to order, to put in series, to superimpose, to translate from one level to another level, and so on and so on and so forth. Well, he's not satisfied to provoke Sartre, and with Sartre, most Western historical, social and political reasoning. He then goes on to really make the claim that what characterizes Western societies is the hope or the view that everything that occurs in them can be ordered or find a place in history. Now, he will argue that history is in fact nothing but the mythology of Western societies, and that what we call history, and when we aim to change history or make history or understand ourselves historically, which is central to Sartre's project, we are in fact contributing to a mythology which interestingly serves to orientate our actions very well and give a context to our thinking very well, but which would fool us if we wish to use it as a foundation or an ultimate justification for our actions and thoughts. Because the moment we press it to work, the moment we make it do some work other than function as a sort of map or road sign, it falls apart. So this is a very intriguing part of the last chapter, and I will just go through it very lightly to entice you to read that book. Lèvi-Strauss says that obviously history is made up of events, but there's nothing inherently historical about events. Every society in the world takes cognizance of events, brings about events, uses them, but they usually place these events within an analytical reason based on structure. The analytical reason doesn't mean some Western concoction. It means a thinking about something in order to take apart and reassemble it on another level. So he will say that the thinking of these societies, non-Western societies, whatever you want to call them, it's uncontentious today, is like a room of mirrors in which the mirrors are slightly angled in relation to each other, so that the event is seen from a number of different perspectives and orders. The event enters into different orders, and by entering into different orders, the difference between these orders makes the event thinkable. So for instance, just to go back to Jacobson's linguistics, metaphor is a result of taking two different orders and artificially aligning them with one word. So you can see for Lèvi-Strauss, the idea of an event is not foreign to a non-historical way of thinking. But for the West, events are things which we like to capture and stick into archives. So we love to have Beethoven's little ear trumpet, and we love to have a letter from Hendrik Verwoerd, or a shoelace from Helen Ziller, or Hillary Clinton, I don't know, chewing gum from Hillary Clinton on the day of her defeat, etc. And, you know, for those who are Hillary Clinton fans, just seeing that piece of chewing gum, you know, in the archive sort of gets their heart beating, says Lèvi-Strauss. He's not talking about Hillary Clinton, of course. His example was a piece of manuscript by Bach, and for somebody who is really like into Bach's music, just that little piece of manuscript, you know, is sufficient to get them very excited. So in a sense, history is composed of events. History doesn't bring about events, but events bring about history. Now, where is this history taking place? We can stash events. I mean, we can make an archive, and we can fill the archive with events, with the remnants of everything that happened. We could have a J.G. Ballard archive and fill it up with all the car smashes tonight, etc. But the point is that we still must ask, where does history happen? And we've sort of looked at the question of, to whom does history happen? For Sartre, it is those groups or those individuals able to formulate a project. You know, Sartre writes an enormous book, hundreds, thousands of pages that he never finishes, on a French novelist, Flaubert. And he's fascinated by Flaubert's childhood because he sees Flaubert's childhood as being something that becomes the basis of Flaubert's reenactment of his childhood through his novels, through his entire adult career as a writer. So the way the individual projects their past into the present is giving form to events and making history. He becomes a great writer by taking the archive, if you like, or the events, the random events of his family, his birth, things he has no control over. And he formulates them as a literary project in order to, in fact, peg himself as one of the great writers, to reflect the world of his time in that writing. But essentially, it is a repetition of his childhood experience that he cannot shake off. So in the case of Flaubert, Sartre is saying, to whom does it happen? Well, it happens to an artist in a project, existential project such as Flaubert, but it also happens to workers, it happens to colonized people, it happens in struggle, it happens in the organization of new types of institution, it happens in new kinds of group. And this thinking in terms of the creativity and the freedom of groups would become a very important element in the adoption of Sartre by the post-1968 movement in France. But for Lèvi-Strauss, there is something completely different going on. It's not a matter of to whom it happens, because to whom thought happens can only roughly be the engineer or the bricoleur, the Neolithic society, the knowledge, the putting together from this way, from sensory experience to signs, and our Western habit of putting things together from signs to objects and sensual experience. Just two different directions on the same formal format. So the question of to whom it happens is not that interesting for Lèvi-Strauss. The question of where it happens is very interesting. Where does the historical event happen? Does it happen to a particular group, to a particular individual? Does it happen in the brain of that individual? Is the brain of that individual a bunch of neurons? Is it happening to a bunch of neurons? Are these neurons a bunch of chemicals, hormones, lesions, etc., etc., etc.? At what level, where is the event? If you wish to say something happens, an event happens, and you want to say where it happens, you are involved in an infinite regress, going down to the level of the molecules, what's happening that day. So in other words, the idea of a total history that uses all the available causal conditions and information simply swamps the historical project. The event becomes unintelligible, becomes homeopathically diluted. On the other hand, if you want to raise up the event and refine the event and specifically insert it into history, you have to provide that event with a code. You have to provide it with something that can classify it and make it stand out against this huge swarm of things which make up the background, the causal texture of events. And here, Lèvi-Strauss provides something really diabolical that's been completely absent from Sartre and anyone else's discussion of history. And he introduces this almost like schoolroom theme, saying that everybody knows that history, the code of history, is dates. You can't really be doing history and not be able to produce the dates. So every school kid remembers history by remembering dates. He says it's a kind of anorexic skeleton of history is dates. He says, but if we look at the structuring of dates, in other words, if we treat dates in history as the coding system which underlies the possibility of historical narrative, then we see something very interesting. We see, in fact, that certain dates, which might be today, 2 hours ago, etc., are very rich in information, but they are very poor in insight and understanding, because the smaller the grain of history, the closer it is to the actual thing occurring. So what's the point of re-narrating it as history, of putting it up on another plane to make sense of it? But if you go up and you start to look at the way historical dates are grouped, they're either put in a simple chronology. The intervals between them, if they're very large, will include prehistory, pre-human history, early human history, classical age, Middle Ages, blah, 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 all these customary big blocks. As you come down, then you will then get into groups of dates which turn around a certain sequence of events, for instance, key dates in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and so on, which relate to each other. And then as you come lower down in history, you get particular sequences down to months, days, hours, etc. But he says all of these series of dates are completely incompatible with one another. You cannot refine the meaning by translating one level into the other, and you cannot investigate them by translating the levels down. So he says essentially the coherence of history, the way in which even the most professional historians or whatever you want to call them, the way the West has history is identical to the level of myth. It pushes particular events around into particular satisfactory arrangement, but these events have got limits to their arrangement, and therefore it makes them into a kind of myth, because myths push around certain qualities and arrange them in a way that makes sense. But in fact, there is no basis, there is no external framework for that activity. You use that sense practically that comes out of it. So he in fact reduces history to dates, says that its information value increases as you go down, but the more you increase, the more you go down, you are stuck in a welter of events which can't be captured historically. You are stuck in chemistry, molecules, the brain that day, or whatever it is. And as you go up, so you get more of a story, you get more of a structure, but in fact you lose information. So he says it's a kind of zero-sum game. So his view of history is that he says we believe history is constantly with us, but it's with us as a kind of myth of the present. We use it as a way of understanding how the present came about and where the present might go. And he says in that respect it plays exactly the role played by the eternal presence in the past of the ancestors in other societies. So here you see something of the tone and also the precision with which Lèvi-Strauss attacks not just Sartre, but through attacking Sartre, attacking the entire project by which the West wishes to both understand and change itself. And that is the project of history and the idea of a particular revelation of ourselves, a particular reason, a particular thinkability, or particular access to ourselves, which is given to history, and history is given to us insofar as we engage it with our action. So there are the two models. There are other intriguing things in Lèvi-Strauss which are really quite astonishing. He will say that, for instance, miniatures, anything that has an aesthetic quality, anything which appeals to us aesthetically, is in fact appealing to us cognitively because it's taken a reality which is very big and shrunk it. So somebody might say that, what he calls the charm of the miniature, scale models and dolls and toys and so on, have a power, cognitive power, because in the smaller thing, we can encompass a huge number of qualities that we can't really, we'd have to individually investigate in the bigger thing. And somebody might object, well, the pyramids are very big things, and they have an aesthetic quality. But he says when you consider that pyramids are a model of the cosmos, they're in fact very small things, and so they're able to condense this understanding. So you have an extraordinary number of discussions, all aimed at puncturing the common prejudice of the West, and the common prejudice that the West believes that it is different, that it is inherently different, that it works according to a different historical, rational logic to other societies. And of course, puncturing the idea that the West can think itself, that it can engage with thought, with what it is on a level of practical action and practical change. And this leads to a rather pessimistic view of politics and history. So that is the debate. And of course, the debate is the debate between dialectical thinking, phenomenology, and structuralism, because you'd have to be dead or comatose for the last 50 years not to see that the Lèvi-Strauss argument is classically a structuralist argument. And in these days when ignorant, resellers package structuralism into curricula, you must imagine these efforts as almost like, who's seen Star Wars, early Star Wars, where they walk into this incredible bar, and this bar is full of the most crazy creatures, and they're all trying to pick each other up, but they're all completely, from completely different worlds. And in this absolutely synthetic bar, the two humans just absolutely don't know what to do with themselves. You can imagine the drinks being served in that bar as being equally synthetic. You can imagine all these aliens kind of looking down onto Earth through some sort of makeshift telescope, saying, they're drinking beer, they're drinking wine, they're drinking gin, etc. And then going back, having done some spectral analysis of this thing, and going back to their alien chemists, and saying, please synthesize some gin, synthesize some beer, whatever, out of molecules. You see in these sci-fi movies, they put something in the microwave, out comes a beer, etc. So they're all drinking these completely synthetic things. Now, it's that synthetic beer made in some sort of outer spatial Taiwan, consumed by a bunch of aliens. That is what you encounter when you encounter structuralism or phenomenology or dialectic in a curriculum. So you can imagine curriculi and the resellers of these ideas and the ones who write commentaries on them and so on and so forth as these extraordinary aliens trying to approximate beer, drink it, and have a good time, but it's coming out of sort of petrol pump. The essence of such exercises is that they are commentaries. And in fact, it's completely redundant to create a commentary. It's quite insulting to create a commentary when the books themselves are really extraordinarily well written. I mean, Lèvi-Strauss' own account of his travels and his formation as a thinker and so on is an extraordinary book, well on a literary level with Sartre. You've got two extraordinary writers. So to hand yourself over to some sort of synthetic alien and consume alien petrol when you could in fact be drinking actual beer is not something that I'd recommend. So you should read these things, and you should not think that in some sense, because these things appear in such a deformed way in the academic curricula, that the academics have in some sense with their commentaries refuted them, even read them, or even had done with them, etc. And it's very important to keep in mind that these kinds of issues that unfold, political, philosophical, aesthetic, do not unfold in an academy. They take decades to enter into the academy. When they do enter into the academy, they enter in a very deformed way, as we'll see when we look at Derrida's entry into the American Ivy League Academy. And there are very clear reasons for this. It's not that academics have ill will or that they're stupid or whatever. There are very good structural reasons why these creations and these debates, which unfold in the public realm, they unfold in the realm of what used to be called criticism. They are engagements not for the sake of a curriculum, for the sake of putting people through hoops or whatever. They are there to try and steer the course of events and change the way people think. And they're particularly effective in that, except they're not particularly effective in changing the way academics think. So you should not take the Star Wars bar, selling the replicas, as a good indication of what's hot and what's not hot. You should go and find out for yourselves. And in fact, follow these debates and follow the consequences of these debates, which is quite an easy thing to do if you have a little patience and humility and just approach these things directly and have confidence in yourself. And you will see that they're in fact very clear, but that the commentaries obscure them for some reason that I still personally find hard to fathom. Okay, how are we on time? 5 minutes. Huh? You close at midnight. Well, we got 5 minutes. Okay. Does anyone have some questions? Yes.
I'm jumping the gun, but Foucault's analysis of both anthropology, broadly sketched,
Yes.
and psychoanalysis
Yes.
as counter-sciences.
Yes.
How would you situate that between the structural determinism of Levi-Strauss and the dialectical historicism of Sartre in this paraphrase?
Well, keep in mind that that Foucault said, yes, they are counter-sciences, but they're no better than the other human sciences. So he quickly corrected the view that in some sense, psychoanalysis and ethnography or anthropology had managed to exempt themselves from the general problem space, determining the human sciences. And that problem space, you'll remember, is a problem space characterized by analogy on the one hand. In other words, the human sciences erect models and organize what they believe is the agent's way of representing things to themselves on analogy to the science of biology, political economy, and linguistics. So this general space, which then has two options. You can traverse it, and you can traverse it in two different directions. The one direction would be to traverse it towards a transcendental foundation, where, in other words, it's captured within what he calls the forms of finitude. And in the other direction, interestingly, you would traverse it in the direction of history and historicism. And his treatment of anthropology is that it reduces history. It's a counter-science because it almost disengages history. And you remember he says that history introduces a constant unrest into the human sciences. It forces them to change their methods but also their data. So it is a principle of unrest for him. And so it is a counter-science to the historicism that provides one way of renewing or stirring this rather closed universe of the human sciences. And then the issue of psychoanalysis is obviously that it moves directly towards, he says it jumps over man in order to move directly towards the forms of finitude, death, desire, law, which are in fact clearly related to life, labor, and language. So there is this strange situation where they're moving in the opposite direction to what would be synthetic for the human science project. They're moving in the opposite direction, but they are not escaping this force of gravity. And then he says, tantalizingly, that however they do intersect one another, and at this point of intersection, they create a pure model of language. And this pure model of language assigns possible individuals to social roles and possible social roles to individuals, but on a very finite basis. A very interesting passage that you raised. I'm very glad you raised that. So in a sense, to answer you properly, Foucault would say that the attempt to create an integral historicism by Sartre appears to be an attempt to state historicism in very pure terms, because Sartre is constantly arguing against what he considers to be the merely analytic reason of sociology, of psychology, of the human sciences. So there is in fact an attempt to create a scission between the way history works based on a praxis and the whole notion of history creating a fertile, and the human sciences creating a fertile relation to one another, as you see in somebody like Brodel or the Annales school, which is very focused on taking from the human sciences, very inspired by the human sciences, to do a certain kind of history. For Foucault, Sartre is breaking this relation and trying to create an absolutely pure logic of historicism. Hence the idea of a critique. In other words, showing how the logic of historicism works in an area proper to itself. And of course, Sartre's constant polemics against sociology in these works, or anything redolent of the human sciences, is sort of evidence of this. On the issue of psychoanalysis, we will arrive at what Lacan makes of this suggestion of a pure model of language when, hopefully, if we live that long, we can look at the four discourse model, which I think is a reaction to that suggestion in the order of things. But I thank you for that question. I think it's very, very germane. So in a sense, Sartre's attempt to create a pure model of historicism is echoed by Levi-Strauss' attempt to completely reduce historicism in accounting for the same phenomena. But neither of them account for those phenomena in terms borrowed from the human sciences, in terms of these analogies and models, etc. So I think for him, they both have got a certain appeal and, in a way, a certain impossibility to them.
The interest in that exact position of the avant-garde. That's the interest for probably both of them.
Yes.
At that point of the avant-garde.
Yes. Because the momentum of formalism is carried through by the avant-garde at that time in the idea of a pure project of writing, the idea of a pure project of textuality, the writerly versus readerly, and so on. So, and I think this really does play around, the way in which psychoanalysis and structuralism, but also let's not discount the role that phenomenology plays in the avant-garde. At that time, I mean, you can't imagine a film like Last Year at Marienbad without the entire phenomenological doctrine, hanging around. So it's not a clear-cut sort of academic curricular issue of do we have done with phenomenology or do we be structuralists or whatever. It will turn out that Derrida actually puts a similar kind of argument against both of these positions. So it's a very interesting, very nice question that you raise. And what do you call these things? A plot spoiler. Huh? A total plot spoiler. But if you come next week, then maybe we can provide some slightly different way of doing these things. But bless you cotton socks for giving the avant-garde a bit of a toe in this discussion. I think it should have a very big role in this discussion, personally. Any other questions? No more questions. Well, if there are no more questions, then you are free to drink. Thank you very much.